and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
Welcome everyone to this video / podcast where I'm going to be responding to the writer and thinker Paul Kingsnorth and to his lecture which he gave at the First Things Conference, the Erasmus lecture it is called Against Christian Civilisation. I'm going to be responding to Kingsnorth partly because a number of people have asked me to do a response. Just for regular Irreverent listeners, just to say that I'm on annual leave of sorts this week, but I couldn't leave you without something to chew over. And so I decided to give you this response, which I've been waiting to do actually for a while. I've listened to this lecture a few times and I've been chewing it over. And this is an important thing for me to respond to, because essentially what Kingsnorth is doing is he is contradicting the central thesis of my forthcoming book. My book is called The Great Return: Why Only a Restoration of Christianity Can Save Western Civilization. So it's basically arguing completely the opposite of what Kingsnorth is arguing in this video. And it's not going to surprise you. Well, maybe it will surprise you, maybe it won't. But it probably won't surprise you, given what I've just said, to hear that I really disagree with the central thrust of this lecture. It's not to say that I don't think that there's lots of good things in this lecture, and I think Kingsnorth says a lot of spiritually really valuable things. But I also think that this lecture presents essentially a false dichotomy between the good stuff that Kingsnorth says about personal discipleship and holiness and so on, and caring about what happens to your civilization as a Christian. I put it like that. He makes some extremely broad generalizations about things in this lecture, and we'll get into it. But essentially, if you haven't listened to the lecture, it might make more sense for you to go ahead and listen to it. And I'll put all the links under the videos and on the podcast and everything. But you can listen to the lecture on YouTube, and indeed, I'm going to play a clip from it later on. But essentially, if you don't want to do that, or if you just need your mind refreshing, Kingsnorth's argument in this lecture is that really what we ought to be doing as Christians in the midst of a collapsing civilization is focusing on personal holiness and on following the teachings of Christ. Now, I don't think anyone can really disagree with that as far as it goes, but I think the problem is in the way that he thinks we ought to be following the teachings of Christ. And really, he's got what would you call it? A sort of anti-civilizational view, and I'll play you the relevant clip in a short while. But an anti-civilizational view, essentially, where he thinks that all civilization, defined in a very particular way, it must be said, all civilization is in some sense a manifestation of human pride and is therefore an affront to God. And it's not really clear what he thinks we should be doing practically, and that's okay. I'm not saying that he's wrong because he doesn't have a practical outworking of it, but it seems at points, at least to me, that he's presenting to us a romanticized view of an indigenous people-like existence, where there's no civilizational structure, there's no infrastructure, there's no farming, there's just presumably being a hunter-gatherer. And Kingsnorth in this lecture, as I say, I've listened to it a few times. I think really what comes across is this idea that kind of way of life is more conducive to the kind of life that Jesus was basically promoting. So that's what I think he's saying. And as I say, I like all the stuff he says about humility and personal holiness and discipleship, and that coming first before caring about social structures and the amelioration of conditions in society and so on. I think that's all correct, but I think he goes way, way too far. And in the course of things, he makes a really false dichotomy between those two things. And these broad generalizations, which he makes, which I just think are so extreme. And having said that, I don't really know very much about Paul Kingsnorth. I've not read any of his books. I've just heard him interviewed. I think I heard him on one podcast once, and I've listened to this because a number of people asked me to listen to it. And I've just read Rod Dreher's new book, Living in Wonder, which is a really good book in many ways. There's a section about Paul Kingsnorth in that book where Kingsnorth gave an interview to Dreher. And again, I thought there were good things in there, but I also thought he made some very, very broad generalizations. And before I start this, I must mention one where he says at one point in that book that there is no mysticism. There was no mysticism in England after the Reformation, basically dismissing the entire history of spirituality in the Church of England after the Reformation. To me, that would be a good example of really, really broad and dismissive generalization that I found really disappointing, if I'm honest with you, because it's just not true at all that there's no mysticism in the history of the spirituality in the Church of England. It's very, very broad, dismissive generalization. Maybe that has predisposed me not to like this lecture very much. I'm not really sure. I am, after all, an Anglican priest. I've written about Anglican theology, and I love Anglican spirituality. And I think that Kingsnorth is wrong to dismiss it in the way that he does in Dreher's new book. And I think he makes a lot of generalizations and dismissive comments here, and I'll get into them. Having said that, I don't want to dismiss him. I think many things he says in this lecture are very, very good and true. Anyway, just comments to prolegomena to get us into this. So I'm going to assume that you listening to this or watching this have seen this lecture or listened to it, and that you can, broadly speaking, follow me. I hope you can, even if you've not. But here we go. So he starts by talking about Native American spirituality and contrasting that unfavorably with Western colonialism, essentially. And I won't go into all the details, but essentially what he does is that he implies that true Christianity, really following in the spirit of Christ, is the same thing as Native American spirituality. Now, he's a writer, so he's not making a precise theological argument at this point, but I think what that does, framing the lecture in that way, is it creates a mood whereby one, or at least it's intended to create a mood whereby one is predisposed to accept his argument against Western civilization as a kind of manifestation of greed and pride and so on, because he's used an example of the destruction of the way of life of Native American people and their spirituality, their metaphysics and so on, by these evil Westerners who are just coming over and killing them and stealing their land and so on and so forth. So immediately he's presenting Western civilization, that as indicative of what Western civilization actually is. These poor indigenous people with their lovely spirituality, they're the ones who've been trampled on. Western people are so evil. And then after that, he's going to move on to talk about more things. But anyway, you have to ask yourself, why is he using this as a framing device for his entire argument? It's because he wants to characterize Western civilization in that way, as rapacious, as greedy, as destructive, as consumptive, and as unempathic towards the beauty and the frailty of indigenous spirituality. Now, having said that, my view of indigenous spirituality and so on, I'd hope is reasonably nuanced. I wouldn't want to be really dismissive of it as a Christian. My view is that many religions, be they indigenous or more developed religions, are often a reflect a desire on the part of human culture in order to reach out for God. And I think that it's clearly the case that religions and indigenous spiritualities and so on, they often find truth and they often are partially successful. But nevertheless, I still believe that Christianity is the culmination, is the fulfillment, is the answer to mankind's longing for God, because this is when God reveals himself to us in Jesus Christ. Does that mean that everything that Christians have always done has been fine and good and wholesome and true to that revelation of God in Jesus? Of course it doesn't, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing culminative in that revelation, in the incarnation. So my view would be similar to somebody like C.S. Lewis, who saw Christianity as the fulfillment of all myth, of all legend, of all of those glimpses of truth that are refracted through global cultures throughout history. So I don't want to be dismissive of that, but I think there's a nuanced view one can take as a Christian. I don't think you need to have this. I don't think you have to have this sort of romanticization of indigenous spirituality, and I also don't think you have to contrast it unfavorably to Christianity as Kingsnorth does. After all, and we don't need to go into this in too much detail, but we know that indigenous spirituality is not always this lovely, cuddly, esoteric spiritual thing, but it also involved huge amount in some places anyway, a huge amount of human sacrifice and child sacrifice and all kinds of awful things, and that Christianity was actually a civilizing force in many instances. So he doesn't say that. He doesn't begin with an anecdote about Christian missionaries and settlers bringing about an end to child sacrifice in temples in Central America or something like that. That would frame the entire conversation completely differently. So anyway, then he goes on from there to talk about the civilizational decline of the West. And at one point he says that the West, well, at one point he says there is no West, and then at another point he says that the West is basically the same thing as Christian culture. And then he goes on to talk about his main opponent in this lecture, which is what he calls civilizational Christianity. So he says that some people recognize that the fate of the West and Christianity are linked to each other very, very tightly, and that the only response has to be a revival of Christian civilization as a social glue, as he calls it, regardless of whether or not Christianity is true. And he says that this is a mistake. He also characterizes this, and he does this several times in the lecture, as the use of Christianity as a weapon. And he doesn't say a weapon against whom, but he does use that word weapon quite a lot. And he gives some examples, and I'll go on to talk about these examples in a minute. But he doesn't give very strong examples, let's put it like that. He gives the example of Steve Bannon, for example. I don't really know very much about Steve Bannon, but something tells me that he's not really representing what I would be representing when I talk about Christianity and its effect upon civilization, although, to be fair, I don't really know very much about what he would think. He also uses an essay that Ayaan Hirsi Ali wrote, I think, not long after she converted to Christianity, and he talks about a Jordan Peterson video that he made addressing the Christian churches. Now, these aren't necessarily terrible examples, but they're not necessarily the strongest example of the kind of thing that I'd be talking about. One of the things I do want to say is that somebody like me, in my book, The Great Return, which is, by the way, available for pre-order on Amazon, published by Hodder in March 2025, I am not arguing for Christianity to be used as a weapon against anyone. My argument would be that Christianity is a civilizing force in human history, and that this is an empirical fact which you can identify if you look through human history. You can just see the ameliorating, civilizing effect of Christianity. And this is because Christianity has introduced to the world and to individual cultures and civilizations various ideas which have had a ramifying effect. Now, the two ideas I mainly discuss in my book are the ideas of monotheism. So that's not just something that comes, it's not an idea which is only present in Christianity. It's obviously present in Judaism as well, but it's globalized in Christianity. And monotheism creates a situation in which people can believe that there's one ethical standard which holds globally, that holds everywhere, because there's one God and the universe is reflective of that one God's intention for his creation. Now, in a polytheistic culture, for example, that's not the case. In the polytheistic culture of the ancient Near East, for example, in the history of Israel, that's not the case, because you've got all these different localized deity who want different things from their subjects. So it's not the same kind of conception of a unified, universal global morality that's given to us through the Judeo-Christian tradition. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing is mankind, men and women, made in the image of God, which again is present in obviously Genesis chapter 1, but then is universalized, globalized through the Christian religion and in the revelation of Jesus Christ that he gives us. And again, if you want to read about this, you could read, for example, David Bentley Hart's book, The Christian Revolution and Its Fashionable Enemies, where he talks about this, but specifically in the context of the ministry of Christ, how he dignified, slaves and outsiders and fishermen and so on and so forth, which was very it was very unusual. Well, it was almost completely unique for the time. So this idea of mankind, men and women made in the image of God, was globalized, was universalized through Christianity. And again, that's become something that we've taken for granted in our culture, and it's given rise to all kinds of patterns and conventions and laws and ways of being that have become invisible to us because we've become so Christianized. So, for example, just to give you one example, the idea we now have of human rights, that comes to us from the Christian medieval period. And it wouldn't exist if we didn't have a concept of a common humanity where human beings were in some sense as valuable as one another and in which they needed to be treated fairly by one another. By the way, if you can hear the voices of children, you're not having a hallucination. My kids are just getting ready to go out somewhere and they're just talking to each other. So just to explain why there's voices of children in the background, do my best to carry on concentrating while I'm hearing this. So anyway, so these theological concepts, they embed themselves in culture and then they ramify out and they have an effect structurally in terms of the infrastructure of civilization. So Christianity in that sense is an ameliorating factor, it's an ameliorating force in history, and it's created, to use Charles Taylor's phrase, the social imaginary that we have today in modernity. Now, in my book, what I'm saying is that as the metaphysical structure of Christianity breaks down, as belief in Christianity breaks down, the social imaginary is changing. We're losing these ideas that we actually do, I think, well, I would hope we would want to hold on to. Mankind is made in the image of God. The idea of there being some kind of universal standard, universal morality or truth to which humanity is called. We're losing these ideas, and we can see that being manifested in various ways through the breakdown of society. So the postmodern or relativistic view of ethics and truth, that there is no kind of universal binding standard of morality. There is no universal truth, but you have your truth, I have my truth, and the way in which human life is no longer treated as universally sacred and in need of protection and love and care, particularly when we're talking about children who haven't been born. Their lives are not worth protecting, and increasingly in terms of elderly people and people who are terminally ill, their lives are increasingly seen as not valuable because they're not functioning economically, or because they're said to have no enjoyment of life, and or whatever it might be, and that's manifesting in a desire for the legalization of euthanasia, which I would say, alongside abortion, is a principal manifestation of the culture of death, as I call it. It's a phrase I take from John Paul II. So that's why it's important that we do have a Christian civilization, because without these ideas, civilization will break down and human life won't be defended. And completely contrary to what Kingsnorth says, I am not suggesting that Christianity should be utilized as a weapon. I'm saying it because because I want people not to be killed. I want people not to die. I don't want there to be a culture of death. I want to live in a culture of life where children's lives are protected, where the elderly are respected and where they're cared for, and where people aren't pressurized to end their own lives just because they are no longer seen to be economically viable, or because some arbitrary measure of quality of life is not being reached by them, or whatever it might be. And I give many, many other examples of this kind of thing in my book. So it's not about it being a weapon. It's about caring for people. And ultimately, it's a manifestation of Christian love. So Kingsnorth doesn't consider any of these things. He just gives these really, I have to say, really poor examples, or at least really undeveloped examples of the kind of thing that he is arguing against. And he misrepresents the idea, well, the kinds of ideas that I'm going to put forward in my book anyway, and that many other people put forward in other ways as well. He mentions Tom Holland. He's obviously aware of Tom Holland Dominion, and there is even a question about it in the comments at the end, in the questions at the end. So he understands, he must understand to some extent the ameliorating force of Christianity within Western civilization, but it doesn't seem to make any difference to him. And this leads me on to another thing about this lecture, which I think is a weakness, which is his exegesis. Now, he argues, so this is part of his anti-civilizational philosophy, and I haven't even got to the clip yet, which we'll get to in a minute, but he argues at one point that the book of Genesis implies that civilization is a result of the fall. And the reason that he says this is because the development of agriculture comes after the fall. Now, that is technically true, that the development of agriculture comes after the fall, but so do many other things as well. And it doesn't mean that they are a product of the fall. It just means that they happened after the fall. So this is a classic case of exegetical post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means after a thing, therefore because of a thing. Agriculture didn't develop, I would argue exegetically, didn't develop because of the fall. It happened because it was always going to happen. Human beings were always going to develop agriculture, whether there was a fall or not, because the development of agriculture is surely part of what we would call the cultural mandate, which is what was given to Adam and Eve prior to the fall, to go out, fill the earth, have dominion over it, and subdue it. Now, I would argue that would always include the development of agriculture, because agriculture is a fundamental part of what it means to subdue the earth, to have dominion over it, to subdue it, and to fill it. In order to fill the earth with people, you have to be able to make the earth fruitful through agriculture. Now, what would that have looked like in a world where there was no fall? It would have looked completely different, but it would still have happened, I would argue. And at the very least, I don't think you can show from the text that the development of agriculture was the effect of the fall, like it's a bad thing because it happens after the fall. Many other, as I say, in the same passages in the early chapters of Genesis, many other things are said to have developed after the fall as well, such as the development of musical instruments, for example. Does Paul Kingsnorth think that the development of music is a result of the fall just because it takes place after the fall and it's not mentioned before the fall? Obviously not. So it doesn't work from an exegetical perspective. Also, he says that that the Book of Judges and subsequent books 1 and 2 Kings demonstrate to us that kings are a result of sinful human inclination. And although I understand that there is some truth in this, I also think that he misses the point that, at least at some stage in the history of Israel, in the Book of Judges, you do have a situation where you have a theocratic civilizational setup, let's say. You have judges who are essentially prophets who hear the word of God, like Gideon, for example, hear the word of God, take a leadership position, become a king, if you like, not a king in the same way as the world had kings, but become a leader, become a ruler over the people, and then they rule in God's name. So even that example that he gives of the sin of the people demanding a king so that they can be like the other nations, even that doesn't really work, because there's a model that comes before that, which presumably God does approve of, which isn't anti-civilizational, which is what he's arguing for in this video. I'm going to come on to his views, his comments about the gospel in a minute. But I just want to talk about his two critiques of Christian civilization, just because I'm kind of going through this chronologically in terms of the notes that I made. The Ayaan Hirsi Ali essay that he critiques this because her essay is called, from memory, Why I Am Now a Christian. And she basically says that the reason that she's a Christian in that essay, I remember it because we covered it on the show, is because Christianity can provide a bulwark against wokeism, against the alliance of China and Russia, I think is what she said, and against global Islam. Now, at the time, I said I thought that was a strange reason to become a Christian. But that doesn't mean that that what she's saying is illegitimate in terms of it being a good thing that Christianity could provide a bulwark against these three things. But nevertheless, it doesn't really do very much for his argument. Again, this is something I discuss in my book, but I do think it's an interesting question as to whether or not people could be more open to Christianity because they see that it has this civilizing, ameliorating power, and that it's had it historically and it has it still today. In fact, I would say I've actually encountered quite a lot of people like that, both personally in my ministry, in my parochial ministry, but also through our podcast. Certainly, people who have become open to Christianity because they've seen the powerful and positive effect it's had in our world today, and they're frightened by its diminishment. He then goes on to critique Jordan Peterson's message to the Christian churches, and I actually think that's a good critique. I didn't really love that video. I'm not massively comfortable with somebody like Jordan Peterson placing himself above the Christian church and telling the Christian church what the Christian church should be doing. He doesn't seem to be willing to join the Christian church, so I don't really see why he thinks that he's in a position to be telling the Christian church what to do. And I think that Kingsnorth's critique of him there is pretty good. He from the Jordan Peterson video, he then goes to argue in favor of what he calls social justice from the book of James. And he there says that kind of thing that James is talking about when he talks about giving to the poor and so on, that this is typical of the New Testament and also of Christianity, which would seem to me to indicate that Christianity has a social and civilizational aspect to it. So again, to me, it seems like this is not necessarily a direct contradiction of Kingsnorth's argument, but is sort of tending in that direction. After all, the book of James, in the passage that he quotes, implies that wealth is necessary in order for the poor to be helped. So you need wealth in order for that to happen. The critique in the book of James that he reads out, and I can't remember, I didn't look up the reference. I think it's from chapter 2 when it talks about you wealthy, wail and howl and all that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily about just that being wealthy itself is going to bring about the wrath of God. It's when wealth is not shared, when people aren't generous. That's what incurs the wrath of God, when people don't care and they don't help with their wealth, those who are poor and those who are in need. That's the point. But anyway, I still would say that that it implies that there is some kind of social and civilizational utility that Christianity promotes. Then he gets into this. Section where he starts to dismiss all of civilization, and this is the point at which I really think that whatever he's bringing into Christianity from his past is starting to show through. Now, after all, Kingsnorth's been a Christian, I think, for only a couple of years, maybe 3 or 4 years or something like that. But nevertheless, this is the point when I started thinking, I'm really just finding this quite strange now, because he's now saying that it's not only Christian civilization that's wrong, it's that any kind of civilization whatsoever is wrong. And this ties in with this thing he says about the book of Genesis, that farming is the result of the fall. And he starts making these anthropological claims that farming has only existed for 10,000 years. And that he also says at one stage that apparently anthropologists know that that the life expectancy of hunter-gatherers before the development of agriculture was around the same age as it is now, which, if that's true, that's an extraordinary claim. And I'd be interested to know if anyone knows if that's true or not. But I would seriously doubt both of those claims, actually. Maybe I'm being influenced by Graham Hancock too much, but it seems to me that it could have been the case that there's been agriculture at other times in human history, and I would be utterly amazed if, say, 11,000 years ago, the life expectancy of your average human being was 80. Or similar to the life expectancy in developed Western countries today. But as I say, those are empirical claims, and I'm not sure whether what he says there is true or not. I find it reasonable to speculate about that. But essentially, he dismisses the whole of civilization. And again, this seems to be part of this view that he has, that really what Christ is telling us to do is to become indigenous hunter-gatherers and to reject all civilizational infrastructure. And that only this can really be pleasing to God. He goes through this critique of Western civilization or modern civilization by going through the 7 deadly sins and saying basically that they characterize Western civilization. And again, I would just say that this is just so, I'm sorry, but it's just adolescent to speak about an entire civilization in this way. Surely there are good things as well that exist within all the horror and awfulness that Kingsnorth appears to see everywhere. And it's funny because I feel like I'm on the other side of the argument to the side I normally am, when I'm being quite critical. I hear him saying, for example, that our culture is based on wrath, and I just think, what does that even mean? What does it mean that our culture is based on wrath, or our culture is based on sloth, or our culture is based on greed, or a culture is based on pride, or whatever it is? Surely our culture is based on a mixture of things. How can it be the case that our culture is based on sloth, for example, when our culture is clearly so industrious that it's created this enormous, technologically advanced, capitalist, global machine? It can't all be based on sloth, can it? It doesn't really make any sense. And then it goes, and then we come to this section, which is the section I want to play to you, because I think it's characteristic of the sort of thing I'm talking about. So let's have a listen to this now. This is Paul Kingsnorth against Christian Civilization. We're about 57 minutes in now. So let's have a listen to this.
But we could go further than this as well, because it's not just a modern civilization, as Ohieser wrote, or indeed Western civilization, which seems opposed to the Christian way. It's
now, Ohieser there, sorry, is the Native American character that he speaks about at the beginning of the lecture. So I should have said that. So sorry, let's just go back, listen to this again, see what he says.
If we were neither greedy nor envious, the economy would collapse in 5 minutes.
Oh, I've gone too far. Sorry. Here we go.
It's been monetized. How else could something as oxymoronic as a leisure industry even exist?
He's just finishing off this thing about the 7 deadly sins.
Our entire civilization then not only fails to resist these deadly sins, but actively encourages and monetizes them. They are the very basis of its existence. This surely is what Ohieser and many other critics, many of them Christians, are able to see. Are Christianity and modern civilization opposed and irreconcilable, as Ohieser claimed? On that basis, I think we can unequivocally say yes. But we could go further than this as well, because it's not just a modern civilization, as Ohieser wrote, or indeed Western civilization, which seems opposed to the Christian way. It's all civilization. After all, the very foundation of an urban society based around agriculture, with wealth and power concentrated in kings and armies, is what Christ called heaping your wealth into barns.
All right, stop there. I'm sorry, but no, it's not. That he's referring to the parable of the rich fool there. And that's a parable Christ tells in order to encourage people to be rich towards God and not to heap up riches on this earth. I'm sorry, but it's got nothing to do with agriculture or kings or civilizational infrastructure. It's just not what Christ is talking about there.
And we know what he thought of that. And when we read the life of Jesus of Nazareth, actually, it's impossible not to see a man who, in some fundamental sense, was uncivilized. He didn't tell us to get good jobs and save prudently. He told us to have no thought for the morrow.
Again, and he's about to go through a list of false dichotomies here, and you'll hear them. Having no thought for the morrow in Christ's teaching does not necessarily mitigate against having good jobs and saving. And in fact, the scriptures which Christ was immersed in and was an expert in, for example, the book of Proverbs, talk about saving and talk about passing your wealth on to the next generation and so on and so forth. So these things aren't necessarily inimical to each other. And indeed, some of the people Jesus interacted with would have had jobs, careers, security in that sense. And Christ didn't just go around telling everyone to not have a job and to not save any money. One example, for example, would be Zacchaeus, who was a wealthy man, and he said he would give away a vast and significant amount of his wealth. But Christ didn't necessarily rebuke him for being a working man or for having a job, although he was a tax collector. So presumably Christ didn't approve of that. But I'm sure there are other examples, soldiers and people like that in the Gospels, who Christ didn't rebuke just because they were working and because they were making money.
He didn't tell us to generate wealth so that economic growth could bring about global development. He told us to give everything away.
Right. Again, so I just think that this is a simplification of what Jesus says. So, for example, for a start, Jesus does talk about economic development in the parable of the tenants, and you could quite easily in Mark chapter 12 or Matthew chapter 21. You could make a case that Christ is there talking about using, in a general sense, using what God has given you in order to develop it, to produce more of it. And I think it would be a completely legitimate exegetical observation to say that could include making money. Now, making money for a good reason, building business for a business for a good reason, for the glory of God, for the continuation of his kingdom, and so on and so forth. But I certainly think it would be strange to exclude the economic aspect from that story when it's literally about money, the parable of the tenants, to interpret it purely metaphorically and say it's got nothing to do with money. So there's that. And then he says this thing about he told us to give everything away. Well, he didn't actually, and I'm going to talk about why in a minute, but let's just listen to the rest of this.
The rich, he said repeatedly, could never attain the kingdom of heaven.
Okay, that is just at best an oversimplification of the reality. Now, he's referring there to a saying of Christ, which comes in Mark chapter 10, and I believe it's in Matthew and Luke as well. I just know the Mark one because I just preached on it recently. Now, Christ does not say repeatedly that the rich cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And he doesn't say that we should give everything away. Okay, that there is some truth in what Kingsnorth is saying there, but it's a massive oversimplification of the case. For a start, Christ didn't repeatedly say this. As far as I know, it's one saying that's taken from one story about the rich young ruler, which, as I say, is found in Mark 10 and elsewhere in Matthew and Luke. We have other details that are filled in. So a couple of things about this. Now, the rich young man comes to Christ. He asks him, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Christ gives him some commandments, and he says, I've done all those commandments. And Christ says, you lack one thing. Go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Now, that said to a specific person. It said to a specific person because Christ, it says here, Christ looking at him, loved him. He saw what the problem was, which was that this man was inordinately attached to his wealth. And Christ was doing a bit of heart surgery there. And he was saying, look, you need to get rid of everything and follow me. Now, does that have some kind of utility or some kind of relevance to us today? Yes, of course it does, but it's not directly applicable in every case. It's not a command that Christ gives to all the world. It's a command that Christ gives to one person. So you have to cross the bridge of interpretation there and try and work out, well, how does that apply to me? Well, yeah, obviously it's saying something about wealth and the danger of wealth having hold over your heart, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody should sell everything that they have and follow Christ. Similarly, Jesus then looks at his disciples and say how difficult it will be for those who have wealth to enter the kingdom of God. And then he says, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. Then Peter, oh no, it's not actually Peter. It just says the disciples were astonished and said to him, then who can be saved? And the best way to translate that, I think, given what I've read, is who among the rich then can be saved? And Jesus looked at them and said, with men it is impossible, but not with God. So let's just listen to what Kingsnorth says again there, just to get it clear in our minds.
It's impossible not to see a man who, in some fundamental sense, was uncivilized. He didn't tell us to get good jobs and save prudently. He told us to have no thought for the morrow. He didn't tell us to generate wealth so that economic growth could bring about global development. He told us to give everything away.
So yeah, he told the rich young rulers to give everything away.
The rich, he said repeatedly, could never attain the kingdom of heaven. He didn't tell us to defend.
Yeah, that is not true. He didn't say repeatedly that the rich cannot attain the kingdom of heaven. He said, with man it is impossible, but not with God, for all things are possible with God. Now, as I said in my sermon I did a while ago, where does that leave us when you cross that interpretative bridge? How then do you apply that to your own life? Well, there's clearly the case. It's clearly the case that Christ is telling us you need to be very, very cautious about heaping up wealth, about wealth taking over your heart, about loving wealth more than God, about having two masters and all of this kind of thing. But it's not as simple as Kingsnorth implies, that the rich won't go to heaven. It's not as simple as that everyone just needs to sell absolutely everything and that any other approach to wealth and prosperity is necessarily inimical to the purposes of God. It's just a massive oversimplification of the teaching of Christ and the Christian scriptures in general.
Our frontiers or expand them. He told us never to resist evil. He didn't tell us to be responsible citizens. He told us to leave our dead fathers unburied.
Again, Christ, there are some things that Christ says about being responsible citizens. Christ render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, implies some kind of level of responsibility as a citizen. And when he says this thing about leaving our dead fathers behind and following him, again, it's not taking into account the broad teaching of Christ and the different things that he says about different issues. When he says let the dead bury their dead, he's saying you need to slough off those things which are going to hold you back in the spiritual life, and that may include not allowing your family or your past or the present situation with your family to hold you back from following Christ. You have to value Christ over everything. But that doesn't mean that you should dishonor your parents and not love your parents. At one point, Christ rebukes the Pharisees specifically for doing that, for twisting the law so that they break one of the 10 commandments, which is to honor your father and your mother. That's the end of that sentence. And there's another little bit here.
And follow him instead. He told us to hate our own parents and love those who hated us.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. He told us to hate our own parents, but he meant that hyperbolically, because he was saying you have to love him first, even over your own family. That's the point.
Every single one of these teachings, were we to follow them, would make the building of a civilization an impossibility. So what we're really hearing about then when we hear talk of defending or rebuilding Christian civilization is not Christianity and its teachings at all, but modernity and its end game.
I don't even know what that's supposed to mean there. It certainly doesn't apply to the kind of argument that I'm coming out with. That's a kind of rhetorical flourish that he brings at the end of this section when he talks about modernity and its end game. And as I've said, I don't agree with him that that the putting into practice of Christianity would necessarily result in some kind of anti-civilizational approach to the entirety of life. And I think I've already made that argument reasonably well. So just a couple of other things here. In the question section at the end, there is a question about, as I mentioned earlier, there's a question about, well, don't you think that the development of hospitals and things like that, the kind of things that Tom Holland talks about in Dominion, which clearly comes from Christian civilization, don't you think these good things are something to be celebrated? How does this fit into your sort of view that Christianity would bring about this indigenous hunter-gatherer type situation? And he makes this distinction there in order to try and answer this question without dismissing the implication of it. He makes this distinction in the question and answer section between culture and civilization. And he wants to put hospitals in the culture bracket, but not civilization. So civilization is evil and inimical to the purposes of God, but culture is not. And the reason he wants to do that is because he sees here that something like the development of hospitals happens within some kind of social infrastructure, but that to admit that something good could come out of civilization would mitigate against his argument. So he creates this other category, which is culture, and presumably he could then conveniently put other things in that category as well, like I would assume art and religion and things like that. Now, you know what I'm going to say here. You can't make a distinction between culture and civilization. You can't make a clean one anyway. So if you just think about that hospital example just for a moment, well, if you want to have a hospital, you need to have, for a start, you need to have money because hospitals cost money. Secondly, you need to have some kind of building. So you need some kind of architectural infrastructure to build buildings. You need people who are able to design buildings. You need materials in order to make buildings. So you need all of those things. You need to do something with the earth to get, for example, stone, or to create glass or whatever, wood or whatever it might be. So you need all of those things. Presumably you need some kind of machines to build a building. Generally speaking, if you want it to be robust, you need food. So if you're not going to be, I don't know, running around outside, killing animals, slaughtering them and cooking them and bringing them to your patients, you need some kind of agriculture, and you need medical supplies, which would imply the development of medical technology and knowledge, which would also imply schools and perhaps universities and things of this sort, which we see developing in the medieval period, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So you need all of those things. And all of those things are products of civilization. You can't just say, well, the hospital is culture and civilization is this evil thing over here, because without civilization, you wouldn't have the infrastructure to actually have hospitals in the first place. And if you did, they wouldn't really be hospitals. They would just be places filled with dying people who were just being cared for, perhaps in a very loving way, but not in a very effective way, because you'd lack all those things. You'd lack food, you'd lack medicine, you'd lack shelter, you'd lack everything that you need to actually have a hospital. So that doesn't work. And it goes for anything else you'd want to put in the bracket of culture as well, such as music or art or even religion. You need civilizational infrastructure in order to have a level of organization within religion, because again, religion doesn't fundamentally rely on these things, but tends to need things like buildings and materials and money and things like that in order for it to actually work. So you can't make this dichotomy between the two. And this is fundamentally the problem with this whole argument, is that Kingsnorth is trying to prize apart these things. And actually, I think that there is, and I haven't quite worked this through, but I think that there is some kind of metaphysical problem with what Kingsnorth is doing, because it's almost like he's trying to separate apart grace and nature. And he's trying to say that humanity can have this entirely graced, spiritual, esoteric existence, which is more indicative of kind of indigenous spirituality. And then when we actually get involved with the material business of existence, which involves dirty things like money and buildings and goodness knows what else, jobs and things like that, then this is actually this is dirty, and this is going to taint us, and we can't actually live a purely spiritual life. The fact is that that's not the way it works. Is that we are embodied spirits as human beings, and that this is actually reflective in our world as well, not just us as individuals, but us as a society as well. We do have a spiritual aspect to us. We do have something that yearns to transcend and to live in a spiritual way and to have some kind of spiritual existence. But we're also physical people who live in a physical world, and we have physical needs, and there's a physical manifestation of the human spirit in that sense. And you can't just eliminate one of those parts of humanity and our civilization and say that Christ was telling us to do that, because he wasn't telling us to do that. I don't believe he was anyway. And part of the reason that we can see this is in the very development of civilizations that were influenced by Christianity, and as a result had a civilizing and ameliorating effect upon the world in which they grew up. So, and this is maybe my final word here, the fact is that when you actually look at the empirical evidence of the situation, it changes your perspective. Kingsnorth refuses to countenance, he doesn't even mention the idea in this lecture, that Christianity could leaven a culture in the way that I've been talking about, in a good way. You could name things which I'm sure that he would agree with, such as the abolition of slavery. And again, the abolition of slavery begins in the first millennium because of Christianity. Slavery is basically all but disappeared by the end of the first millennium. Now, it is revived in early modernity, and that's a terrible thing, but it was again abolished in the 19th century, beginning in Christian Britain. And it wasn't abolished anywhere else prior to that. There weren't cultures, there weren't empires anyway, and civilized nations where slavery was abolished. It was abolished because of Christianity. I don't know what the situation is in terms of indigenous cultures and slavery. I assume there wasn't as much because there wasn't the same kind of civilizational infrastructure. But I don't know. It's beyond my kin, beyond my realm of knowledge. Perhaps somebody can help me out with that. But the point is that Christianity clearly had an ameliorating influence in the abolition of slavery, which is hardly an insignificant thing. You could also look at something like the civil rights movement. Again, I don't agree with everything Martin Luther King said, or did actually, but on the whole, you would have to say, wherever you sit on your view of King's legacy, that it was a very, very good thing, that he was involved in a very, very good thing from a specifically Christian perspective, and he and the people around him did an awful lot of good for the culture of America and more broadly for race relations in the world in the 20th century. And as I say, King was specifically influenced by his Christian faith, not even influenced by it, was animated by it. I've got a book of his sermons over there, which I've read a number of times. I think it's called A Gift of Love. And it's a beautiful book. Again, he sometimes says some things about colonialism and things like that, where I think he goes too far. But basically, he is a Christian minister, and it's specifically through his Christian values that he was animated to do what he did and to create a better situation in the world than the one that would have persisted otherwise. So those two things, I think you could bring to bear fairly obvious examples. But you could also talk about many other things as well. In my book, I've got a long chapter on history. It's not too long, by the way. It's a very exciting chapter. But it's about the Middle Ages a lot of the time anyway. And in the Middle Ages, and again, there are many books that I cite here. David Bentley Hart Atheist Delusions, the first book I read, which made this point to be, but there are many others as well. There's Seb Volk's The Light Ages. There's Edward Grant, I think it's called Reason and Science in the Middle Ages. There's, of course, Tom Holland's book, Dominion. But there are many, many other books which make similar points about the development of various things that we take for granted today, which all happen in the Middle Ages. I've already mentioned hospitals, schools and universities in the way that we know them today. The utilization of reason and its widespread application in society, which is linked to the development of science. Now, in the Middle Ages, astronomy was the main discipline, but many other scientific disciplines were growing up at the same time, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, which led to the flowering of science and its eventual utilization for the purposes of technology and other things from the 17th century onwards. That was a legacy of the Middle Ages, and Middle Ages was fundamentally Christian in nature. Yes, in the Middle Ages, also have the development of agriculture out of agricultural technology. Now, the development of things like mills and plows and things like this. Now, Kingsnorth presumably wouldn't admit this as a good thing, but most people would, because this created a situation in which food could be produced for more people, so not as many people went hungry. You could also talk about the development of music in terms of notation, polyphony, choral music, leading into, of course, the later Middle Ages, and then into the Renaissance, Enlightenment, and early modern period, where you have the development of modern musical instruments and the orchestra and so on and so forth. But you could talk about many things as well, like the invention of clocks, which happened. Seb Volks writes about this in the Light Ages. The development of clocks and timekeeping. Glasses were invented, as I'm wearing now, in the Middle Ages. And there are many, many other things that are taken for granted. Now, the link between these things and Christianity is not arbitrary. It's the Christian metaphysic that makes all of this possible, because Christian metaphysics posits this unity which underlies all of reality. And therefore, or I should say, this is why people assumed that the widespread application of reason would be successful, because there was one unified reality which they were accessing through the use of reason. And as I say, it's concomitant approaches to the world, such as empiricism and the investigation of nature, which leads eventually to modern science. But as I say, to all other kinds of technological developments as well. So all of this is a legacy of Christianity. All of this is not possible without Christianity. And all of this is a reason why Christianity is fundamentally a good thing in the Middle Ages and following, and prior to the Middle Ages as well. And my argument is that as the Christian metaphysics disappears, so all of this other stuff, all of this other good stuff will disappear. I don't mean glasses will disappear. I mean the metaphysical framework which led to the development of good things within civilization. I've only just named a few. There are many other things I can mention as well. These things are breaking down, and they will continue to break down because of the breakdown of Christianity. That's the reason. Now, in my book, I'm not saying this because as a sort of argument for anything, really. I'm not proposing anything politically. I'm not saying therefore we need some kind of Christian nationalist party or anything like that. All I'm doing is I'm just making the observation that this is the case, and that for this reason, it would be a good thing, for this reason and many other reasons as well, it'd be a good thing if there was a widespread revival of Christianity. And as I said, these kind of observations do often have the effect of making people more open to the possibility that Christianity might be true. And in some sense, it might actually help them intellectually in a similar way to the way that apologetics sometimes helps people intellectually. It's not the full story by any means. And for many people, they're not thinking about Christianity in this way. But many people actually are. And for many people, I think that these kind of observations can be helpful. And I think that Kingsnorth, in his attitude, at least in this lecture, and I'm sure he's a very nice bloke, but in this attitude, he's so dismissive of any of these ideas. He's so extreme in talking about the devastation and the evil and the wickedness that Western culture and civilization has brought everywhere. He's always using these words like everywhere, always, all these kind of things, that he doesn't actually consider these things that I'm bringing to bear. So that's what I'd like to say in riposte to Paul Kingsnorth. I don't believe that God is against civilization. I think civilization is actually a gift of God. I think the cultural mandate is given to human beings: fill the earth, subdue the earth, make it flourish. I think that all civilization is included within that cultural mandate. Now, is there sin? Is there evil? Is there abuse? Is there murder? Is there genocide? Is there exploitation? Is there the rape of the natural environment? Of course, there's all of these things. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any civilization at all. That's just throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I don't want to live in an indigenous hunter-gatherer type situation, actually. It might be appealing to some people, and that might be why they're more open to this kind of thing. But actually, I don't think we have to want that in order to be genuine disciples of Christ. Having said that, and let me try and finish on a positive note, we should nevertheless listen to what Kingsnorth is saying about humility, about saying our prayers, about being really serious Christians, and listening to the words of Christ and being his disciples as well as we possibly can. I completely agree with Kingsnorth, but nevertheless, we are still in the world, as Christ says in the high priestly prayer. I do not ask that you should take them out of the world. That's what Christ says there. He says to the Father, I don't ask that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. And in that high priestly prayer, we get that phrase, don't we? Which many people will know, many Christians anyway will be familiar with that phrase: in the world, but not of the world. And I think that characterizes, or at least that epitomizes what I'm trying to say. In the world, we are in the world, we are in civilization, we are in an embodied context, which we just simply cannot escape. Most of us can't anyway. But even though we're in the world, we don't have to be of the world. And I do agree with Kingsnorth that it's in not being of the world that we can actually transform and change the world. But that transformation and change in the world is a fundamentally good thing, which is to be celebrated. Does discipleship come first? Does holiness come first? Does Christian love and transformation come first? Of course it does. But that doesn't mean it can't lead to something good and can't lead to something which ameliorates conditions in societies and, yes, even builds up Christian civilizations. So there's my case. And if you want to hear more about that case, you can pre-order my book. I'll actually put a link for it below this podcast. The Great Return: Why Only a Restoration of Christianity can save Western civilization. Better get that name right before it's released. And you can tell me what you think as well. Tell me what you think by writing me an email, reverendpod@gmail.com, or just putting a comment below this video on YouTube or wherever you find it. Also, if you are a long-term listener of this show, of Reverend Pod, of our Reverend podcast, and you know what this is, do please consider supporting the ministry. I'm a vicar. I'm not dressed like one today because I'm on holiday, but I'm part-time vicar. So I keep a church here, Holy Trinity Winchester. Come along if you're interested, by the way, Winchester, UK. In the city, you can find our website, holytrinitywinchester.co.uk. But I'm also a writer and I make podcasts as well. And I rely on the money I make through those things to live. So if you'd like to support me and to support Irreverend, then please go to website irreverendpod.com and become a patron today. You click on the big red button which says Patreon, and you can support us for as little as £1.50 plus VAT in the UK per month. I release all the episodes that we make early. You also get a bonus audio podcast, which is me and my two other colleagues, Thomas and Daniel, chatting about various extra things. And you get the added benefit of knowing that you're supporting me and you're supporting the podcast, which of course costs money to produce as well. So please do go to the website reverendpod.com and become a patron today, or you can buy us a coffee. Click on the big yellow one, yellow button, and buy us a coffee there. So you can actually help by supporting us and going on that website. Anyway, I don't expect Paul Kingsnorth is going to watch this, but if he does, I'd be very interested to hear what he's got to say. And also, I hope that there are no hard feelings at all. It's good that we can listen to each other's ideas and critique them. I think from what I know of Kingsnorth, he seems like a really, really great bloke. I know many people who know him, and they speak very highly of him. I'm sure he's a very, very sincere thinker and Christian as well. And I've got a lot of respect for him. I don't agree with what he says in this video by and large. There are many things I do agree with, but the overall thrust I don't agree with. Also, I don't like his comments about Anglicanism in Dre's new book, although I really like Dre's book. I think it's a really good book. And I'd encourage Kingsnorth to look into the history of Anglican spirituality as a point of starting. I'm just quickly checking the name of this book. Yeah. There's a book, an anthology, which I've actually got on my shelf, called, hang on a second, what is it called? I'm sure it's called The Beauty of Holiness, and it's edited by Rowan Williams. What is it called? I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, a moment of humility there. Let me see. Oh, that's what it's called. It's over there. It's called Love's Redeeming Work. It's by Rowan Williams. Love's Redeeming Work. There it is. I'm just finding it now. Sorry, man, look stuff up on computer. Yeah, Love's Redeeming Work, The Anglican Quest for Holiness. So its compilers are Rowan Williams, Jeffrey Rowell, and Kenneth Severson, and it basically gives you. It's like a reader in Anglican spirituality, basically, which goes back across the centuries, takes in people like Thomas Traherne, John Donne, George Herbert, but I mean, just many, many, many people you've never even heard of, hundreds of writers in the Anglican tradition. Love's Redeeming Work, The Anglican Quest for Holiness, where you can see actually there's a beautiful tradition of spirituality in Anglican Christianity, and we don't have to reject it because we think it doesn't exist. So I'm obviously going to say that I'm an Anglican priest, so I hope that's okay, that I can bang the drum for a bit of Anglican spirituality, but it is real. It does nourish people. It nourishes me. The tradition that comes to us through the Book of Common Prayer, and it's a beautiful thing, Anglican spirituality, and I just don't want people to dismiss it in a way that I see in that book. So that's another thing I wanted to say. Anyway, love to Christian brothers such as Paul Kingsnorth and others, especially those with whom we disagree about things from time to time. Love to you all. Really looking forward to being back with you next week with a normal episode. We have actually got an interview with Roger coming up shortly, hoping to do that next week. If not, then very soon. Tom and Daniel will be back as well. I know people are always wondering where they are when they're not on the show. Sometimes I just have to do them by myself, and sometimes it's good to do them by myself. But we will be back properly, hopefully next week, in the weeks leading up to Christmas and in the weeks of Advent. And that's all I've got to say for now. Until next time, keep watch and keep the faith.